Hello, my name is Stephen Thomas, and this is another video in my series, Azure Integration Services and Hybrid Options. In this video, we're going to talk about Azure Logic Apps and talk about the differences between consumption and standard edition of the Logic Apps. Now, it can be confusing that there are two different types of Logic Apps. The consumption version of Logic Apps came out around 7 years ago, while the standard edition of Logic Apps came out about 2 or 3 years ago. Now, they're very different under the hood in the way that they run, but there's a lot of things that are very similar, like the designer is a very similar experience, yet they're different designers. So it can be confusing kind of look at what's the difference and where you should use consumption versus standard. Now, I've tried to explain this to folks in the past that are very new to Logic Apps. 4 or 5 times in the past, I've given this similar type of talk. The very first group, I would say, was probably more confused at the end of my talk than at the beginning. So hopefully by now I've got it a little more perfected. In addition to talking about the standard versus consumption, we also need to talk about the pricing details between the two, because the pricing is going to matter in terms of which direction you might lean towards in terms of building your Logic Apps. For all pricing details, of course, always check out the Microsoft documentation because pricing can change over time. With that, yes, it can be confusing, but I'm going to try to break it down and make it a little more understandable. So let's get started diving into consumption versus standard. I've thought long and hard about a way to try to compare and contrast consumption versus standard, try to put it in a way that's more relatable to folks. So I've come up with this analogy, and you'll have to let me know what you think of this, is consumption is a lot like a cat. So we have cats, we like cats, they're our pets in our house, they take care of themselves a lot, they're kind of low maintenance, so we like cats. But then we think of a standard edition Logic app, and they're a little more like a dog. So we like dogs in our house. We have dogs as pets, and cats and dogs are both pets, and they both bring us joy in our life, and we like to have them. But that's how we get to a cat like consumption Logic apps and a dog like standard. So why am I using this analogy? So consumption Logic apps, much like a cat, are very easy. There's not a lot of thought that needs to go into how we take care of the cat on a daily basis. We bring the cat into our house, give the cat a litter box, give him some food. We don't have to take him on walks. We don't have to take him outside. Very easy experience to take care of a cat. And all in all, they're low maintenance. I don't have to really worry about what that cat's doing in a day. Most of the time, cats aren't out getting into trouble. Can be rest assured that my cat's going to be in good hands throughout the day. So the consumption edition Logic apps is very much similar to experience of having a cat around the house. Now we think about having a dog around the house, and it's a much more challenging experience. A lot more thought has to go into the day of a dog's life. So it's much more work. I think everyone would agree a dog is much more work than a cat, just like a standard edition Logic app could be a lot more work than consumption. In addition to introducing a dog to your house, there's a lot more to get set up. So you have to have a dog bed, you have to have a leash, you have to have a strategy to take them outside, and then when it's raining, you have to account for that. Just like standard edition Logic apps. You have to plan for how many Logic apps are going to be in your environment, how are you going to break those up in your app service plans, how you want to structure resources inside Logic apps because they can have multiple workflows. So it's a lot harder to set up and take care of than a consumption Logic app. So at the end of the day, what does it really mean with consumption and standard? Well, they can all run together. There's no reason you need to be all consumption or you need to be all standard. You can definitely have a mix that involves all types of Logic apps and just understand where you'd want to use one over another given your specific business scenario. So let's talk about a little bit more about the hosting options and where these things run at and why consumption is going to be like a cat and easier to take care of. So consumption Logic apps, they're going to be all Azure hosted. So they're all going to be Microsoft managed. We don't have to worry about resource contention between our own Logic apps. So there's no hosting needed with this. It's also a nice pay-per-use model. So it's a serverless model. So if our Logic app sits there all month, runs only a couple times, we're only charged a few fractions of a penny for that execution. Now, with that, you are in a multi-tenant Azure hosted environment. So your logic apps could be running next to a noisy neighbor that's consuming more resources. So that's something you'll definitely want to keep in the back of your mind. But they are going to be fully supported and managed by Azure and the Microsoft team, so we don't have to worry about scaling up and scaling down with our consumption logic apps. There also is no support for virtual networks with consumption logic apps. So if you need to use that in your solution and you have an express route set up, you need to have all your components on the same network, that you would want to look at moving away from consumption. Now, that doesn't mean consumption can't access on-premise resources. It still can using things like the on-premises data gateway. It just means it can't be directly on that same network. Now, there used to be another hosting option for consumption, but I'll just mention it here. It was the Integration Services environment, also called the ICE environment. This was a fixed fee unit of work, but it's been retired as of August 31st, 2024. You can't even create new instances of this any longer. So just know there was an option here, but it's no longer available. So quickly, let's talk about pricing. As I mentioned, consumption is serverless, so it's pay per execution. You actually get your first 4,000 actions free, which is a plus. And you can see here it's a very small amount of money per execution. You do pay more for connectors than you do for actions inside your Logic app. And then there are some few 8 or so enterprise connectors where you do pay even more than that for those. These are small numbers, and I did some math. If you ran 3,500 actions and 500 connectors per minute per month, your bill would be $6,500. Now, that's an intense amount of processing there. One of my first clients that I set up Logic apps, their bill is $35 a month, and that does all of their EDI billing and processing for their whole month for $35. So you can see that's a very good price point and entry into a Logic app-based solution. I did another price analysis, and I think it was 10,000 messages a day, and you had about 20 executions or 20 actions per Logic app. You're looking at about $180 a month. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about consumption. Yeah, it's pay per use, and it can be relatively inexpensive, even with some high message load. So how do we host our standard edition Logic apps? Let's talk about that. So they're done a little bit differently. So they can be hosted in Azure, and Microsoft will maintain the environment for you. And they run in what's called an app service plan. So you can think of an app service plan kind of like a virtual machine. It's out there. It's kind of semi-isolated, but it does run on shared hardware. So your app service plan could be running next to other people's app service plans on the same equipment. So you want to keep that in mind. You still could have the noisy neighbor scenario. Data has to stay within the same region with an app service plan. So you can't have an app service plan that has Logic apps for multiple regions in it. It all has to be within the same region. Your pricing that you pay for your app service plan is going to be based on the hosting plan that you select. Now, for Logic apps, we currently have 3 versions of the hosting plan. We'll take a look at it in just a moment. But the plus here is your app service plans do have support for virtual networks, which is a big plus. There's also an option to have a more isolated environment called an app service environment. And there's several versions of these. To be supported with Logic App Standard, you have to be on V3 of the app service environment. And these are going to be single-tenant and isolated environments, which is good. But for these, you must use a virtual network. Your app service environment has to be set up as specified on a virtual network. So all in all, you get much better network control in terms of integrating your app service environments with your on-premises resources. This would generally be used along with Express Route, so where you have your on-premises data center connected with your Azure resources using these app service environments and your Express routes and setting that up. So it's a much more advanced scenario. So a little bit more about standard. Also has Kubernetes in preview. These would be using pre-provisioned clusters, is designed to run in the Azure Kubernetes services environment, and they're working on getting it all Arc enabled for on-premise deployments as well. And if you wish, you could even run these on other cloud providers, which was something one of my clients was looking at. And with Standard Edition, you also have that option to run it in your own data center. You could run and host the Logic app environment on a server, and then maintain all that. It'd be just very similar to running BizTalk server on premise. You're gonna be responsible for all of that hardware. I, for one, like to be out of the hardware game, so anything Microsoft hosted, I tend to go that route. So what's the pricing on standard? So this is going to be for the standard app service plans. These would be what we would build our components against in the Azure Portal, for example. They have a monthly rate of between $175 a month and $700 a month. Now with this, there's also other charges such as storage transaction costs, and then there's still the cost to those managed connectors. So the standard edition logic apps have the ability to have built-in connectors. So there's a subset of connectors that run in process essentially with that standard edition logic app. So those all run self-contained. So if you were running your logic app locally, for example, there'd be no call anywhere outside of your environment for those connectors. Now, a lot of connectors are Microsoft managed connectors, and those, no matter where you run your logic app, if you call that connector, it will make a call to the Microsoft hosted API connector and create that connection and make that call for you. So there is still the managed connector cost associated with that. That's the same if you're running in Microsoft itself in an app service plan, or if you're running on premise in your own Visual Studio instance or in your VS Code instance, it'd still be there. There is the plus side here with standard is there's no integration account needed if you want to do maps, schemas, and use .NET assemblies. So this is definitely a huge plus to introduce these into consumption. There's a substantial price hit for that. And the only catch here is, that's why I have the asterisks, is they're compartmentalized at the workflow level, and we'll talk about the workflow in just a moment. At the workflow level, which generally contains about 10 or 15 logic apps inside there. So if you have schema and maps that need to be shared across many logic apps, for example, you might have to multiply deploy those to multiple workflows, or have a third-party service that manages it, or still use your integration account if you go that route. Real quick, the ASE v3 environment. These are pretty standard pricing. These can be used for other things besides logic apps as well. Their monthly prices are between $240 and about $1,000 a month. There is other costs with this, like you do require your virtual network. And for comparison, that retired ISE environment is almost $5,000 cheaper per month for this ASE environment as compared to the ICE environment. So what are my recommendations? What should you do if you're new to logic apps and want to get started? Well, here's what I would suggest. There's no reason a solution you build for an enterprise client can't be both. You can definitely have a mix of consumption and standard. They're separate. You can't cross deploy. You can't build it in consumption and then just automatically move it to standard. They do have a converter tool to help with some of that, but they're different workflow definitions. So you can have both of them coincide and have them do different tasks. So I always recommend, especially new developers wanting to just jump in and work with logic apps, to start with consumption. It's going to be your easiest. Even if you build out an enterprise or a business grade scenario, build it out in consumption. Most of the time it's going to be pretty straightforward to move it over to standard. And there is that converter tool if you wanted some help. But just open up 2 windows and open up 2 designers, and once you've worked out the details in consumption, can move it to standard. But if you wanted to have a long-term bet, you're all in on logic apps, you're going to essentially, like if you were migrating a BizTalk environment to logic apps, I would bet more long-term, be more focused on standard edition. Consumption and standard, I think, will always be there. There'll always be kind of the options between the two. Newer features and things tend to come to standard first. So keep that in mind as you build out solutions, especially if they're going to be full, like multi-year BizTalk migrations. I would tend to focus more on standard. So there are lots of factors that come into play. If you have a lot of workflows that don't run very often, that might be a strong contender for consumption. If your network policy enforces that all components must be on your same network, connected via express route, via a virtual network, well, then you're going to have to go to that standard route. And if things don't match between the two, you'll have to come up with a solution that does work for you. Features and connectors are not always in sync. So this was a much larger problem 6 months to a year ago, where Consumption had a rich set of connectors, and they were porting them over. There's some differences in some of the connectors when you move them over to standard, especially when you talk about the built-in connectors that run in process with standard as compared to standard and Microsoft managed connectors where you have to make a call out. So there was some contention around that. It's gotten a lot better now. So parity between the two is much better. There's still things that come out and get you kind of new features in standard, like you can now run essentially functions in process with your standard edition logic app. It's like a .NET method. It's like in BizTalk where you had helper.NET classes in your orchestration. Now you can have that same thing in standard edition. It's going to run and be hosted inside that same process. That concept doesn't really exist for consumption logic apps because you're in the serverless environment. So with standard, you do have some additional kind of bells and whistles that you can work with there. And if you're going to be all in and you're going to do like a big BizTalk migration, I would definitely look at the ASE v3, setting up your express route, getting your network, fully connected and integrated between your on-premises data center and your Azure environment. So when it comes to building out solutions, here's just a picture I copy and pasted from the Microsoft help documentation. The differences between the single-tenant and a multi-tenant environment. Microsoft classifies standard edition as single-tenant environment because you have the ability to very easily be isolated in a single-tenant environment. Multi-tenant is going to be your consumption logic apps. And the way you build solutions is a little different. So with standard edition, you have the Azure Portal, of course, and then you have VS Code. It's going to be a supported development tool to do local development of your logic apps. You still will need internet connection because there's query out quite frequently to get a list of connectors and stuff like that. Your multi-tenant, your consumption logic apps, you can build them in the portal like you could standard, but it also does support VS Code and some older versions of Visual Studio as well. It has a plugin for that. And you can also do other ways to deploy your scripts, as you can see here. So your designing and development would be a little bit different between the two. Okay, so with that, let's jump in and let's see a quick demo of creating both a consumption logic app and a standard edition logic app. Okay, I've now jumped over to a virtual machine that has already logged me into the Azure portal. We're just going to go up here to Logic Apps, and I'm going to click Add, and going to leave my subscription the same. I think I already created a resource group earlier, a live demo. We'll give this a name, Demo Consumption 0505 to make sure it's unique. It's a workflow. I'm going to leave it in East US, and I'm going to switch it to consumption-based logic app. And with that, you can see some of the other options here went away. I can select do tags where I can set like a cost center and go to review and create and go create, and it's going to go ahead and create my logic app for me. It takes just a few moments to create this logic app. And I'm just going to jump into the resource really quick and show you that here you have your logic app. I can jump right into the designer at this point and start building actual physical components to this logic app. So in this case, this logic app is going to be my workflow and is going to do the work for me. You take a quick look over here on the left. This is your core settings that you have for this logic app. And I'll go through them in more detail in some of the other videos. But just to know that this is where you would come and control all these settings at the scope of just this logic app. So let's see what it's like to create a standard edition logic app, because the experience is going to be very different, or a little different, I should say. I'm going to keep the same subscription and live logic app standard. And going to keep it at workflow. I'm going to leave it at East US now for just a moment. Keep this at standard. And then you see now that I have standard still selected, I have to select a Windows plan. I have to select an app service plan for this to run in. And then it says new because no plans exist. And then I can select the size, the pricing options of this plan. And you can see here it gives you an estimate of what that's going to cost per month. In this case, I'm going to switch my region to Central US. And in this case, I have an existing app service plan that it pre-populated here for us. If you remember, the app service plan resources can't span multiple regions, multiple data centers. So that's why you have to select the data center that your app service plan resides in, and then you're able to select that app service plan. So if you're struggling, can't find your app service plan, was sure you made it, go check what region you created that app service plan in. So I'm going to leave this as default here. Zone redundancy, just leave that there. And now you jump over and we have a lot more things we have to think about. Just like bringing that dog into our house, we have to think about the toys for it to play with and all that, dog bed, all the good stuff. Here we have storage. So storage is going to be where our physical Logic App files are going to reside. So we have to set up a storage account. We can just leave the defaults and it's going to create a new one for you. And here we have the ability to set up some network settings for this. So you can enable public access, enable network injection if you would like. So it does have some virtual network support here, but we'll leave that the same. Come over here, you can select application insights right here at the time of creation that you can assign to this. If you wished, we'll just leave that for now. I'll set my cost center. And review and create. Now this will also take just a moment to create, and we'll see it over here on the right when that is complete. And it's going to go ahead and provision this. We'll take it just a moment. Okay, that's completed. So now we can click go to our resource. And don't forget, if you miss this status bar on the right, they're all up here where the bell icon is. So I'm going to go to that resource. And what we see here is this has a different look and feel as compared to the consumption Logic App. So in Standard Edition world, you can see up here it says Logic App Standard. The Logic App itself is a container for other workflows. Container is a poor choice of words there, not to be confused with other containers. It's more like a site. So I think of it kind of as IIS, it's a website in IIS, where then you can have multiple files, multiple HTML files in there. Well, you can have multiple workflows inside of a single Logic App standard. And those are you'll see over here. So if we look at the left side over here, we see it's very different than what we saw in consumption. And we have our workflows, connections, and parameters. And then down here, remember I mentioned we can deploy our schemas, maps, and assemblies directly to Standard Edition. Well, we can do that here. We can upload schemas and maps right here if we wished. Down here, some additional settings, scale up, scale down. That's one you want to look at here. So now I have to be concerned with the resourcing of this app service plan. So as with consumption, we didn't see these kinds of options of setting scale up and scale down because it's going to take care of that for us. Now we have to be more mindful, more understanding of the workloads that we're going to deploy into this Logic App Standard Edition component there. App service plan, we can jump into our app service plan and adjust those settings at the plan level, see resource allocations and all sorts of stuff like that, and even change that app service plan if we need. Some other things down here about some API management, some monitoring tools, automation. All in all, a lot more options than what we saw in consumption-based Logic Apps. So a lot more stuff we have to worry about. Let's go ahead and create an actual workflow here. So I'm going to jump into workflows. And it says we have no workflows. I can click add. And here I was just going to say live demo. And as compared to what we saw with consumption, we have two options here. We can create a stateful Logic App or we can create a stateless Logic App. Stateless Logic Apps don't give you the ability to walk through action by action and see all the inputs and outputs of that. Stateful will give you that experience just like you get in consumption. Now with stateless, you can come in and turn on what's called a debugging mode, and then you're going to be able to get that state. So keep that in mind. Stateless isn't always better. There can sometimes be restrictions in different connectors that you can or cannot call in a stateless experience. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. So it definitely fits a need when you need a low latency scenario. There's also been some complaints around the fact that it's no logging at all, so you don't even know if it gets executed. So it's can be challenging to work with in a stateless environment. You'd have to go in and turn on that debugging mode to start seeing if anything is even happening. So for now, let's click Stateful and I'll click create. And that's going to create pretty quickly here, and I can dive into here. And if you are experienced with the designer, I'll dive into here. This designer is a little bit different. You'll see there's a very different look and feel between the designers. This has, I guess I'd call it a more modern look, kind of a, I don't know, cooler look. Definitely is some differences, and things are, I feel, laid out a little better here. You have the ability to add the trigger. Trigger is going to be your entry point into that logic app. But here you have this ability to set the runtime. So I mentioned a little bit about things that run in process versus things that make called into Microsoft managed components. You can select those here. And if I select an app, these are going to be all the components that run inside of this logic app directly. So things like file, things that you would think would run in process, generally do. Things like an HTTP request, schedule to kick off that logic app and stuff like that. We'll just click schedule for now and select that to leave us our time interval. And then we can go ahead and select actions underneath that. And you have the same experience here. I can say shared in this case, and these are going to be all the Microsoft managed connectors. The one that if you were running this locally or running it in a different cloud provider, you would still be charged those small fractions of a cent for calls into these Microsoft managed, Microsoft hosted components. And it does call them shared so that you do realize that they're all multiple tenants calling these at the same time. These aren't a dedicated environment like you get with the logic apps. These aren't dedicated API connections for you. The in-app ones are, of course. So you have a lot of options here. Like I said, there's hundreds and hundreds of connectors, ever-growing list all the time. So now once I'm done, I can click save on this logic app, and it's just going to save this logic app, and now it's going to execute every 3 minutes. Of course, this one doesn't do anything for us, but we could add actions down here and have this perform work tasks for us. So this was just intended to give you a quick overview of how you create consumption and standard edition logic apps and the things to kind of think about when creating one versus the other. Okay, hopefully you liked that quick demo. If you want to learn more or see all the videos in this video series, go to stephenwthomas.com/learn. I'll have a list of all the current videos available and all the planned ones I have coming in the future. If you want more specific details about logic apps, there's some good Pluralsight courses out there, one on enterprise messaging and enterprise logic apps. Those are the more current. There's a couple older ones called Getting Started and Fundamentals. Both those concepts are very relevant today. Everything you see in there, I think, get applied to both standard and consumption edition logic apps. It's more conceptual in both of those. So I'd recommend those as well. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.